Hi, Westside. Even though we are separated from each other at this moment, it is still great for me to know that you're there in your living rooms, your kitchens, connecting with us and worshiping and growing together. And here's the good news: God is with us too. Before we do anything else today, I just want to bring 3 encouragements for you. Number 1, I want to encourage you to participate with us. It's much easier to be passive when we're watching online, but what would it look like today if you and your family worship along with us? Worship shapes us and it forms us by participation. So why not give it a try? Secondly, our team are working hard on a week-by-week basis to monitor, adjust, and navigate the sensitive financial time that we are in. I want to say thank you to those who are continuing with your generous support to us. But if you're not sure how to give during current restrictions, you can use our app or website to easily set that up with us. And finally, Hebrews says that we should spur each other on in love and good deeds. Even when you're isolated, we can still do that. So make a few calls, encourage your neighbors, even just share this service on social media today. Even in the midst of everything that's going on, this time could be the right moment for someone new to connect with the love and grace of Jesus. I miss you, Westside, but let's keep trusting Jesus to be with us through all of this.
Well, good morning. We're so glad that you've invited us into your home again today. If you've just found this church online, we welcome you. And as we continue in this season of Lent, we didn't think we'd have to give up quite so much. But here we are, together yet apart, finding ways to be creative in worship together. So let's sing. You've overcome this world with love and made my fight your own. And now lift my eyes and throw fear aside. Won't let the darkness beat me down. Sing in the night, my hope's alive in you. And I'll walk through the fire and not be burned. Pray in the fight and watch it turn. Jesus, today I give it all to you. All to you. Here I am, down on my knees again, surrendering all, surrendering all. And find me, Lord, Lord, as you draw me near. I'm desperate for you. I'm desperate for you. I surrender. Drench my soul as mercy and grace unfold. I hunger and thirst. I hunger and thirst. With arms stretched wide, I know you hear my cry. Speak to me now. Speak to me now. I surrender. I surrender. I wanna know you more. I wanna know you more. I surrender. I surrender. I wanna know you more. I wanna know you more. Like a rushing wind, Jesus, breathe within. Lord, have your way. Lord, have your way in me. Like a mighty storm, stir within my soul. Lord, have your way. Lord, have your way in me. I'm still in your presence, all the noise dies down. Lord, speak to me now. You have all my attention. I will linger and listen. I can't miss a thing. Lord, I know my heart wants more of you. My heart wants something new, so I surrender all. And all I want is to live within your love, be undone by who you are. My desire is to know you deeper, Lord. I will open up again, throw my fears into the wind. I am desperate for a touch of heaven. You're the fire in the morning, you're the cool in the evening, the breath in my soul, you're the life in my bones. There is no hesitation, I will linger and listen. It's the sweetest of all. Lord, I know my heart wants more of you. My heart wants something new, so I surrender all. And all I want is to live within your love, be undone by who you are. My desire is to know you deeper, Lord. I will open up again, throw my fears into the wind. I am desperate for a touch of heaven. I open up my heart to you. I open up my heart to you now. So do what only you can. Jesus, have your way in me now. I open up my heart to you. I open up my heart to you now. So do what only you can do. Jesus, have your way. we acknowledge your presence this morning. It's all around. There's no replacement or substitute for being with you. So we have come and we've breathed in your presence and felt the safety of your comfort and your peace in this time. And today we commit to leaning on your truth. Amen.
Just before the teaching today, remember our kids program, 4, 5, and youth teaching are all available on the homepage at WKC.org. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, as we'll be posting throughout the week.
David has set up an online study of the letter of Philippians, and he invites us to join him this Tuesday at 7 p.m. So if you'd like to engage in this, go to our website and you'll find all the instructions you need on how you can join, and we'll learn how we can still find hope and joy, even in a time of isolation.
Hello again, friends. It seems like everything that we do at the minute needs to begin with with us saying something along the lines of, these are sort of strange times, because every day seems to have different requirements of us that are abnormal, unusual. In our households, let me put it like this. We never really subscribe to the whole condo method. We don't just throw things out randomly. We love to kind of hold on to stuff, because I'm a very sentimental person. So if something has a story or a meaning, or if I have some memory attached to that something, then I always want to keep it. As a result of this, what this means is my daughter has been spending her time in isolation, essentially kind of digging her way through all sorts of old things and, toys that she's not played with in a couple of years, things that she didn't remember that she still had. And this has created this scenario, and I wonder if some of you can relate to this, where she came to me the other day there with this thing that she'd found and she wanted to play with it, and of course the batteries are flat. And so we open it up, and the kind of age-old tradition of all kids' toys is, do you now have the right battery? Which, of course, we didn't have. And then you become kind of face-to-face in a 7-year-old's world with the challenge that we now find ourselves in, that something as simple as buying a battery is now no longer kind of really easy for us. And you start having this discussion about whether going to the store for a battery is really essential enough to warrant traveling out and about to do something like that. And that's just one side of these kind of strange things that are happening. And then on the other side, we find ourselves listening in and kind of holding on for what sort of news is coming our way. I got the message this week, the kind of message that you find yourself, dreading and hoping doesn't happen, that, my mom seems to have come down with coronavirus, and perhaps you've had that as well, and someone you love, someone you care about has reached out and said, you know what, it looks like I'm also having these symptoms, and it doesn't really matter whether your loved person is the other side of the Atlantic, as it is in my case, or whether they're just down the street, because we can't go and see them. We can't spend time with them. And so the sublime and the ridiculous is happening in our lives, where one moment the lack of our freedom is being presented to us in the inability to buy batteries, and then in another moment it's in the inability to see someone that we love and that we care about. Our grief and our disappointment and our fears and stresses are something that we're struggling with, but I wonder if they're all made worse by our lack of freedom. We're used to being able to just go wherever we want and whenever we want, and all of a sudden now we're being asked to stay in single locations, to just stay in this one particular place. And so as Christians, we kind of wrestle with this through in terms of, well, what do we do when we're in a situation like this? What does Scripture do to help us? How does us, kind of moving into that path that Christians have for many years done, which is leaning into Scripture and saying, is there hope, advice, or guidance in there for us? And so for me, I find myself reading Paul's letters, treasured by Christians for thousands of years now, that Christians have read and studied and engaged with Paul's letters. And it strikes me as interesting that we constantly turn to Paul's letters, particularly in times of trouble, because a good chunk of this group of letters in the New Testament written by Paul are written by someone who was in prison. When he wrote this, he was in isolation. He was stuck in a particular place. So Paul is writing to these churches, and he is in isolation. Maybe we're a little bit now like, respect, Paul, we understand your journey. And I'm kind of not sure we entirely do, because Paul was in a Roman prison. Roman prisons had more than just a toilet paper shortage going on in them. And have you noticed how your trips to the store now are very different than what they used to be? When I used to go to the store, my kind of anxiety for the store shopping would be for things that I wasn't sure I was going to be able to get. Like, hey, I wonder if the store has Mexican oregano today, because I'm not quite sure if I'm going to be able to find any. And now I'm going to the store going, hey, I wonder if they're going to have things like soap and toilet paper. But Paul was in a Roman prison. In a Roman prison, you don't get food. They don't care for you. They just chain you up and leave you there. If nobody sends you food, if nobody brings you supplies, if nobody else cares for you, you are essentially completely and utterly alone. And in this context, Paul writes several letters. In fact, there's quite a few of Paul's letters are literally known as the prison epistles. And one of the letters that Paul writes from prison is the letter to the Philippians. And this is strange because the letter to the Philippian church is one of the most encouraging letters that Paul ever writes. And yet he's in prison when he writes it. Let's read a little moment of that letter right now and see if you can spot that it's obvious that he's in prison. Paul says in Philippians 1 and verse 3, he says, I thank God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. Being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. It's right for me to feel this way about all of you, since I have you in my heart. And whether I am in chains or defending and confirming the gospel, all of you share in God's grace with me. Now, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. That's how Paul opens a letter that he writes from Roman custody. That letter represents a characteristic and an attitude that, has totally been my attitude during our lockdown. Like all the time, I've just been oozing joy. Or have I? Paul seems to leak joy out of himself. He's happy to write to these Philippians. He's encouraging. He's enthused with the gospel. It's really easy to read these words and not even believe that he's in any sort of trial or hardship, much less being in a Roman prison. How is Paul able to take a complete isolation, an imposition upon himself, a removal of his freedoms, his agency, his rights? How is he able to take all of those things, turn it around, and not just to be positive in it, but to actually see the whole situation as an opportunity for good? How do we get from crises to opportunity for good? Like, it's deeply rooted in the notion of Scripture. Think of Psalms like Psalm 40, that we can find ourselves in a pit and we can cry out to God and say, God, rescue us in this time. But Paul seems to want to push us a little further than that. He doesn't just want to think about a sort of flat level of where do we survive, but rather he wants us to look beyond the sort of nature of our impositions, the nature of our isolations, and actually ask a different series of questions. Is it possible that even in this situation, there can be an opportunity for Jesus to work, an opportunity for the gospel to happen, an opportunity for good? Now, I want to extract kind of three things that I think Paul does in this. So we'll go a little old school today on how we do that and just give us three things that we need to remember, three perspectives, let's call it like that Paul takes to help us understand this. The first thing I think you'll see Paul do in order to take the perspective that he does is he has an advanced perspective on freedom. He takes this advanced perspective on freedom and he adds that to an actualized perspective on love, which finally leads him to an authentic perspective on community. An advanced perspective of freedom, an actualized perspective of love, and an authentic perspective of community. So let's begin with freedom. I wonder if when we reflect on it, one of the things we struggle with in this moment in our history is the constraints that are being put on our freedoms. Like we're just not used to living with any sort of constraints on our regular freedoms. Most of us, our ability to move as freely as we want is quite wide. It's quite huge, actually, if you think about it. With the exception of some of the more extreme and expensive things, we can kind of do what we want a great deal of the time. We sort of almost live like modern cowboys, or rather the dream of the cowboy. We're just free to go wherever we want at any moment. We get on our horse and we head off in whatever direction suits us, and we do whatever we want. Freedom for many of us is probably described as radical independence. In fact, our view on freedom as contemporary people is it's almost religious, the way that we look at freedom as a right for us, a right to be able to be independent and do whatever we want. Think about car commercials. How often do you see a car commercial that looks nothing like your life right now? The car commercial isn't the sports car, packed full of the entire family in quarantine, driving, a block around the city because that's as far as we dare to go. No, car commercials are always set as just you and the open road, and you can drive wherever you want. You're never quarantined in the dream. You're never isolated in your dream, because freedom for us is having no restrictions. I get to do whatever I want. There's opportunity for me to do that, and there's choice for me to do whatever I want. So psychologically speaking, this restriction that we're living in right now is really hard for us because we're being asked to restrict ourselves. But notice the type of restriction that we're being asked for. It's not simply a restriction to stay in place and limit your movements for your own sake. One of the major reasons that our local governments are asking us to limit our movement is for the sake of others. It's for the sake of the many. That we would hold off what we normally do, what we normally have full freedom to do, that we would actually think differently because of everybody else. And I think it's fair to say that we don't often have to think that way. It's interesting that a lot of us, particularly as modern people, resonate with Paul's words in another one of his letters. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 1, Paul says, "For freedom, Christ has set us free." And we that passage speaks to us. We say, yes, freedom. I've got freedom, and it allows me to be free. But if you actually look at how Paul talks about freedom, notice what he does. For freedom, he says, Christ has set us free. Notice that freedom isn't something that he has by rights in the way that he explains it here. Freedom for Paul is something that Christ has given to him. Freedom is a grace gift for Paul because it's for freedom that Christ set him free. He has his freedom because it's a gift of God. Now, this doesn't deny that we have freedom, not even slightly, but what it does suggest is that, or rather more, what Paul is acknowledging here is that freedom is a gift of grace. And because it's a gift of grace, then, freedom naturally for Paul has connections to issues of trust and love and responsibility and even courage. These are all connected to his idea of what it means to be free. because it's a gift of God, which is why, actually, just a few verses later in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 13, Paul says this. He says, "You were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love, become slaves to one another." Like, whoa, wait a minute, Paul. Like, what are you talking about here? 1 minute we're talking about freedom, and the next minute you're talking about us being enslaved to one another. Like, freedom and slavery are on different ends of the spectrum, Paul. Like, they don't go together. But Paul has an advanced perspective on freedom. Paul seems to understand that freedom can't simply mean that you have an escape from all your responsibilities. Freedom can't simply mean that you get to do whatever you want. Because that's going to be not freedom for everybody else. Paul seems to understand in this advanced perspective that he has that freedom comes with limits. And if freedom doesn't have limits, then it ceases to be freedom. So what Paul starts to push us towards as Christians is that the freedom we have in Christ, the grace of freedom that has come to us, is guided and shaped by a desire to care for others. And this doesn't limit us. Actually, it defines who we are. What defines us as humans as being different than just any other species in creation is that we have the ability within our limits to use our freedoms to serve each other, to use our freedoms to help one another. Freedom is limited because it's given to us by grace. And that defines the type of people we are and the type of freedom that we have. But why does Paul talk about it like this? How does Paul look at something like freedom and say, well, no, freedom doesn't just work to do whatever you want, but rather, because that actually might lead to self-indulgence, rather freedom should be focused on the other. Well, why does Paul think that way? And I think he's able to think that way because he's driven by a slightly different motivation. And what is the motivator that would suggest to Paul that he accept the limits on his own freedom for the sake of others? Well, for Paul, the answer to that is pretty straightforward. The answer is love. But for Paul, when he talks about love, it's really important that we kind of just hold on to what is it that Paul's actually talking about when he's talking about love. You see, love for Paul isn't a theoretical concept, or love for Paul isn't an emotional response. Love for Paul isn't even a kind of chemical reaction. Love for Paul is always actualized as a person. It's not a theory, it's not an emotion, it's not some chemicals, it's an actual person. Because love for Paul is Jesus Christ and what Jesus did for us. You might notice Paul's in prison. He's writing this letter to the Philippians. His letter starts with joy. It starts with the opportunity for the gospel, even in the midst of all of his difficulty. But in chapter 2, he starts talking about Jesus. And particularly, he starts talking about Jesus' self-sacrificial journey to rescue us through death on a cross. Now think about that. For Paul, he sets Jesus up at the very start in chapter 2 of Philippians that Jesus was God. And in one sense, we would say, wow, imagine if that was me. But what do we see in the trajectory of the story is that Jesus gives up his rights and his freedoms in order to rescue us via death on the cross. And for Paul, this shapes the whole world. This changes the way that we look at everything. In fact, the 16th century Christian reformer Martin Luther regularly used to say that the cross proves everything. So love, faith, attitude, worldview, and even something like freedom are all considered Christian only if we can see them modeled after the shape of the cross. I like how Fleming Rutledge sort of guides us in this, and I think she's really on point when she explains the cross and the crucifixion in this way. She says the crucifixion is the touchstone of Christian authenticity, the unique feature by which everything else is given its true significance. It is in the crucifixion that the nature of God is truly revealed. So for Paul, this would then mean that freedom, this grace gift of God that we have, is governed by cruciformed love. By love which is cruciformed, love which is cross-shaped, love which is Jesus-shaped. See, you can only understand the values of Christianity, you can only understand what it is that Jesus is calling us to if you understand that Jesus lived a cross-shaped life, a cruciformed life. And this is important to us as Christians if we're going to define love to each other. So in another Pauline letter, when he writes in 1 Corinthians, he starts to define love for us, and he defines it in a passage that you've probably heard read in weddings before. But in 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 7 and 8, Paul says this. Paul says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. Now, this isn't sentimentalized love that Paul is talking about here. This isn't emotional love. And Paul is definitely not talking about some sort of chemical reaction that you might have. But when he talks about love as something that bears all, believes all, hopes all, endures all, and never ends, it's important to remember that what he's talking about is the love of Jesus, a love that is shaped by the limiting, sacrificial, world-changing moment of the cross. That love for Paul is defined by Jesus giving everything up for us. So his notion of freedom, Paul's advanced perspective on what it means to be free, is rooted in an actualized, personified, cross-shaped, cruciform love. It's a freedom that can bear all things. And if you think about it like that, we wouldn't often describe it as freedom if we were talking about something that bore everything or put up with everything or endured everything. How often does the term endurance and freedom go together? As soon as we need to endure, it stops feeling like freedom, but that's the love that Paul introduces us to in Jesus. And these things then, this advanced perspective on freedom and this actualized perspective on love are the basis of what Paul then thinks it means to be in authentic community. When we look back at this point in history in the future, and I'm confident that we will look back on this point in history, I think what we'll realize, I'm pretty convinced that what we'll realize is that what we were actually short of at this moment in history wasn't freedom, but it was actually community. And maybe we've been short of that for a long time. I mean real community, authentic flesh and blood community. We're doing a fantastic job right now working through the internet and talking to one another. People are having WhatsApp calls and FaceTime calls and Zoom meetings, and we're watching church on YouTube, and we're connecting over Instagram. And these things are all fantastic. But humans are embodied people. We need flesh and blood. We need high fives and hugs. Those things are important to us. But despite the fact that we can't be together, this is still a time to work out what it means to be authentic community. The limitations that we're living under, might not end up being to help you. You've been asked to stay at home. You've been asked to not go to work. You've been asked to not send your kids to school. You're not able to go to university yourself. I don't know what it is that you're currently dealing with that's holding you limited in. And you might think to yourself, I'm not even sure I'm at risk, or I'm not even sure I'm, a high-risk person. But these limitations that are being placed on you are to help others, your vulnerable neighbor, your sick neighbor, your weak neighbor. The limitations that are being placed upon us right now by our provincial governments, by our local governments, by our world governments that are being placed upon us, they're actually an opportunity for us to work out authentic neighborly love, because we're being asked to limit ourselves for the sake of the other. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul reminds us that community isn't one member, but many. And that if we really get an understanding of community, if we really grasp an authentic community, Paul says it's like a body. There might be many parts, but all of the parts need to work for the good of the whole. The modern myth of freedom generally destroys community. But a cruciform view of freedom and love calls us to act in ways that serve our neighbors, that do good for our neighbors, that help our neighbors. Now, if you're not sure which neighbor we're referring to specifically right now, then there's a fantastic parable by Jesus in Luke and chapter 10. It's about a man. The man is a Samaritan, a good Samaritan. Perhaps you know this story. But let's be honest. This is a difficult, painful, and scary time. And in the midst of all of this difficulty and this pain and this fear, you're limited, you're constrained, you're isolated. And yet Paul is able to somehow trust Jesus in the midst of this, to look beyond his own situation. And Paul does something which is quite profound for us to remember. That he seems to, in Philippians, say that even though he is limited, that doesn't mean that God is limited. And so if he can look beyond his own limitations for now and see that this is still a moment for God to work, it's still a moment for people to trust in Jesus, it's still a moment for God to help people and come along behind people and beside people and before people. For Paul, the gospel isn't changed because he's in prison. And as such, Paul realizes that he actually does have freedom. It's just that his freedom is a different definition than we would often use today. It's an understanding that God is at work and that history is longer than just the present. And as such, Paul can make a choice. He can make a choice as to how he's going to be. He's going to make a choice as to how he's going to behave in prison, as to how he's going to behave in this moment of isolation. See, because freedom is always a choice. Richard Balcom, in his brilliant book, God and the Crisis of Freedom, reminds us of this. He says, freedom is perfected in the choice to be good and not evil. There's a choice for us in every moment of every day to work out our freedoms by choosing the good and not the evil. And our choice at the minute is a difficult one. Because at the moment, to make the good choice, to actually decide to do the good thing, actually means that you're being asked to do very little. You're being asked to be passive. You're being asked to be patient. You're being asked to stay at home and don't go anywhere. Don't do anything. And perhaps for many of us, we'd be okay if our government said to us, hey, get on board and help with this, go do that, because we love doing. Because we anything that we can put our hands to do, it makes us feel like we're being useful. And at the minute, we're being asked just to do very little and to stay safe and to keep our neighbors safe. Freedom is sometimes the choice to do the good thing, which is also the hard thing. In the second chapter of Paul's letter to the Philippians, he tells us a little bit more about his depth of his understanding of this. Paul is in prison. He's in a Roman prison context. That means he's not being fed. He's not being cared for, as we've already said. And the church in Philippi, they heard about this. And what they did is they sent him supplies, and they sent a person with those supplies. Epaphroditus. This man from the Philippian church came, and not only did he bring supplies to Paul, but he also looked after Paul. He would ensure Paul was being fed, cared for, and doing well. The problem is, Epaphroditus makes this huge sacrifice to come from Philippi to where it was that Paul was in prison. And while he was there looking after Paul, Epaphroditus himself got sick and nearly died. He did get better. And as he got better, Paul then realized he was faced with a choice. Should Paul do the selfish thing and say, hey, Epaphroditus was sent to look after me, so I'm going to keep on letting him look after me? Or Paul could do what was best for Epaphroditus and the church in Philippi, which is to say, he should send Epaphroditus back so that he can fully recover and everyone can stop worrying about him at home. What should Paul do? Do what's best for himself or do what's best for the community? And for Paul, what we see in Philippians is the thing of faith, the thing that required immense faith in God, was to exercise his freedom for the good. Not for his own selfish choice, but for the good of everyone else. And he made the choice to sacrifice for himself and send Epaphroditus home. And we too, as a community, as individuals, as a church, we've been faced with cascading requests in these last few difficult weeks. Many of us can't go to our places of work. We can't go to our schools. We can't go to our church. And there may yet be more difficult choices coming in the weeks to come. We're currently in what we would call a liminal space. We've talked about this with you before already this year. We just didn't realize how liminal the space that we'd find ourselves in was going to be. We're in a liminal space, which means we're not back there anymore, but we don't yet know what the future looks like. We're not sure what the ensuing weeks and months are going to be like. But what if Paul's advice from a Roman prison is still true? That the cross of Jesus will guide us in how to continue making good choices. Choices that aren't always the easiest or even the most natural, but choices that live in our call as God's people to seek the welfare, the peace, the wholeness, the shalom of our city and of our world. Choices that are governed by a cross-shaped perspective on freedom, on love, and on community. So I want to pray for you this morning. I want to pray that you find it in yourself that, like Paul in his moment of isolation, he's able to still trust in Jesus. He's able to still hold on to what it is that God has called him to. And he's able to work out his freedoms through a loving, cross-shaped model for the good of everybody. So may you find strength in Jesus, as Paul did, so that you too will find a way to live out good choices that reflect what it is that you believe. And may God's grace and peace be with you. Amen.
The grander earth has quaked before, moved by the sound of his voice, and the seas that are shaken and stirred can be calmed and broken for my regard. 'Cause through it all, my eyes are on you. 'Cause through it all, it is well. 'Cause through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well with me. Far be it from me to not believe, even when my eyes can't see. And this mountain that's in front of me will be thrown into the midst of the sea. 'Cause through it all, my eyes are on you. 'Cause through it all, It's through it all, through it all. My eyes are on you, and it is well. It is well. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. Waves and winds still know His name. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. Waves and winds still know His name. The waves and winds still know His name. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. It's through it all, through it all. My eyes are on you. It's through it all, through it all. It is well. It's through it all, through it all. My eyes are on you, and it is well.